There are moments in life when you understand that everything you believed about the world was built on a foundation of lies. There are moments when you realize that the people who were supposed to protect you have become the people who are destroying you. There are moments when you understand that innocence is not a shield against accusation, and that the truth is far less powerful than a well-constructed narrative designed to make you disappear. My name is Stephanie Boyd, and I am telling you the story of how I became invisible. I was born 36 years ago in a small town called Salem, Oregon. Salem is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where reputations are currency, where the social hierarchy is fixed and difficult to escape. I grew up in this town. I went to school here. I built my career here as a nutritionist, working at the local hospital, helping people understand the connection between what they ate and how they felt. I loved my work. I loved my life. I loved Salem. And then I married Brian Watson. Brian was an architect. He was brilliant at what he did. He designed buildings that were both beautiful and functional. He was kind. He was thoughtful. He was the kind of man who actually listened when you spoke to him. He was the kind of man who made you feel like your thoughts and feelings mattered. Brian's mother was Allison Hanson. Allison was a woman of significant power in Salem. She owned Hanson Realty, one of the largest real estate development companies in the Pacific Northwest. She was wealthy. She was well-connected. She was respected. Or at least she was the kind of woman who people pretended to respect because she had the power to make their lives difficult if they didn't. Allison never liked me. I understood this from the moment I met her. I understood that she saw me as someone who was taking her son away from her. I understood that she viewed our marriage as a betrayal, as if Brian had chosen me over her, and no amount of kindness on my part could ever bridge that gap. But I tried anyway. I tried to be good to her. I tried to include her in our lives. I tried to treat her with respect and affection, and none of it mattered. She remained cold toward me, distant, disapproving of choices I made and dreams I had for myself. 3 years into my marriage, my husband died. He died in a fire. Our home, a beautiful Victorian house on Maple Street, burned to the ground one night in October. Brian was inside when it happened. He didn't make it out. The fire department said that the fire started in the basement, that it spread rapidly, that by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was too late. I was at work that night. I was at the hospital with a client. I didn't find out that my house was burning until someone called to tell me. I remember the feeling of the phone against my ear. I remember the words that the person was saying. I remember the moment when I understood that my husband was dead. The fire was ruled accidental. The investigators said that there was old wiring in the basement that could have sparked. The house was old, they said. These things happen. And then, about a week after Brian died, I was arrested. The police came to my house, or rather, they came to my hotel room, because I no longer had a house. They told me that they had reason to believe that I had set the fire. They told me that there was evidence that suggested I had deliberately burned down my own home to collect insurance money. They told me that I had killed my husband. I was shocked. I was confused. I was convinced that there had been some kind of mistake, that once I explained the truth, once I made the police understand that I had loved Brian, that I would never have hurt him, everything would be resolved. I was profoundly wrong. The case against me was built on circumstantial evidence. The insurance money was significant, $500,000, and I would benefit from Brian's death. The fire investigators found accelerant in the basement, which suggested that the fire had been deliberately set. The police found text messages on my phone where I had joked to a friend about wanting to escape my life. They found medical records showing that I had been taking antidepressants, which they used as evidence that I was mentally unstable and therefore capable of killing my husband. None of this was evidence that I had killed Brian, but it was evidence that I looked like someone who might have killed him. The media descended on Salem like a plague. Journalists came from Portland and Seattle and San Francisco. They came to cover the story of the beautiful nutritionist who had killed her husband to get his money. They came to talk to my neighbors about whether I had seemed capable of such a thing. They came to report on my life, my choices, my grief, as if my grief was evidence of guilt rather than simply the normal response of someone whose husband had just died. And Salem, my Salem, the town I had grown up in, the town I had built my life in, Salem turned on me. My clients stopped coming to my nutritionist practice. My friends stopped calling. My colleagues at the hospital stopped speaking to me. People I had known my entire life crossed the street to avoid me. People who had known me as a child looked at me with suspicion and fear, as if they were suddenly seeing me for the first time, and what they were seeing was a murderer. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution presented their circumstantial evidence. They called witnesses who testified about my demeanor, about my marriage, about things I had said that could be interpreted as incriminating if you were looking for an incriminating interpretation. The defense tried to argue that the evidence was insufficient, that there was no proof that I had done anything wrong, but the jury didn't believe them. I was convicted of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced me to 25 years in prison. I served 3 years of that sentence before something happened that would change everything. I received a package in the mail. It had no return address. Inside was a document, a report from a toxicologist. The report detailed the findings of someone named Lawrence Gray, a chemical engineer who had worked for the city of Salem. The report described the presence of thallium in Brian's blood. It described the toxicological findings in detail. It described how thallium was not a product of fire, how it could only have entered Brian's body through deliberate poisoning. Thallium. The word meant nothing to me at first. I didn't understand what it meant. I didn't understand why someone was sending me this information. I didn't understand how this information could possibly matter now that I had already been convicted. But I found Lawrence Gray. I tracked him down to an abandoned laboratory on the outskirts of Salem. I drove there one cold evening in November, 3 years after the fire that had destroyed my life. The laboratory was a sad, empty place. It was the kind of building that had once been important and vital and full of purpose, but had been allowed to decay into abandonment. Lawrence was there. He was waiting for me. "I knew you would come," he said when I walked in. "The report," I said. "Tell me about the report." "The report," Lawrence said, "is the truth. Your husband was poisoned with thallium approximately 2 to 3 hours before the fire started. He did not die in the fire. He was dead before the fire began." "But that's not what the official report says," I said. "No," Lawrence said. The official report says the fire started accidentally due to old wiring, but I knew that something was wrong. I asked to examine your husband's tissue samples. I found the thallium. I reported it. And then? I asked. And then, Lawrence said, the report disappeared. The tissue samples were destroyed. I was told that my findings were inconclusive. I was told that I had made a mistake. I was told to stop asking questions. By whom? I asked. By people who were more powerful than I was, Lawrence said. People who had reason to want you to be convicted of your husband's death. People who did not want the truth to come out about how your husband actually died. I didn't understand. I didn't understand who would have wanted Brian dead. I didn't understand why someone would poison him and then burn down the house to make it look like an accident. I didn't understand what this had to do with me, with my conviction, with my prison sentence. But Lawrence knew, and over the course of the next few hours sitting in that cold laboratory, he told me. He told me that when the fire department had investigated the fire, they had found accelerant. But he had also looked at the accelerant, and the accelerant pattern suggested that the fire had been set in a very specific place, in a very specific way. It suggested that someone who knew the house very well had set that fire. He told me that he had requested the tissue samples from my husband, and he had found thallium, a significant amount of thallium, the kind of amount that would kill a person relatively quickly and quietly, without obvious symptoms. The kind of poison that could be introduced into someone's food or water without them realizing what was happening. He told me that he had tried to report his findings to the police, but that someone had convinced the police that his findings were unreliable. He told me that he had tried to go to the district attorney, but that someone had convinced the district attorney that he was unreliable. He told me that he had watched as the investigation shifted away from the idea that Brian had been poisoned and moved toward the idea that I had killed him in the fire. Why didn't you tell anyone? I asked him. Because, Lawrence said, I was afraid. Because I didn't have proof of who had done this. Because I was just a chemical engineer, not a detective or a lawyer. Because I didn't know who I was dealing with or what they might do to me if I pushed too hard. And now, I asked, why are you telling me now? Because, Lawrence said, you have already lost everything. Because you have already been convicted and imprisoned. Because I realized that my silence was not protecting me. It was just making me complicit in the destruction of an innocent woman. Lawrence gave me the tissue samples. He had kept them in a cryobank, stored in a way that was legally questionable but scientifically sound. He gave me the original report, the one that had disappeared from the official record. He gave me everything that he had. What do I do with this? I asked him. I don't know, he said. I'm not a lawyer. I just know that you deserve to know the truth about what happened to your husband. I know that you deserve to know that you didn't kill him. I know that you deserve to know that someone else did. I left that laboratory with my life restored and my life destroyed simultaneously. I had proof that I was innocent, but I also had the knowledge that someone had poisoned my husband. I had the knowledge that someone had deliberately killed him. I had the knowledge that someone had then allowed me to be convicted for that murder. And I had a name. Or rather, I thought I had a name, though I didn't understand it yet. The name of the person who had the most to gain from Brian's death and the most to lose from the truth coming out. Allison Hanson, my mother-in-law. The woman who had never liked me. The woman who had always treated me with cold disapproval. The woman who controlled a real estate empire that was worth millions of dollars. That night, sitting in my car in the parking lot outside the laboratory, I made a decision. I decided that I was going to find out the truth about what happened to Brian. I decided that I was going to prove that I was innocent. I decided that I was going to make sure that the person who had killed my husband paid for what they had done. I didn't know at that moment how much it would cost me to pursue the truth. I didn't know how many other lives I would have to affect and disrupt. I didn't know how many people I would have to ask to take risks on my behalf. I didn't know how many people would be willing to help me, and how many would be willing to hurt me. But I made the decision anyway, because innocence, I had learned, is not enough. Innocence doesn't matter if you don't have someone willing to fight for you. Innocence doesn't matter if you don't have proof. Innocence doesn't matter if everyone around you has decided that you are guilty. So I decided to fight. And I decided to find people willing to fight with me. Getting out of prison was more complicated than I anticipated. I had been convicted based on the evidence that had been presented at trial. New evidence would require going through the appeals process, which meant finding a lawyer who was willing to take on a case that had already been decided, that had already been covered extensively by the media, that had already been dismissed by most people as a closed matter. I needed help, and I needed to find it quickly before Alice and Hannah had any chance to realize that I had discovered the truth about what had happened to Brian. I called a lawyer in Portland. I told her about the tissue samples. I told her about the thallium. I told her about Lawrence Gray and his report. She listened to me, and when I had finished telling her everything, she told me something that broke my heart. Even with this evidence, she said, an appeal is not guaranteed. You were convicted based on the evidence that was available at trial. New evidence might be enough to overturn your conviction and grant you a new trial, but it's not certain. What we need is to identify who poisoned your husband and prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. It was Allison Hanson, I said. It has to be Allison Hanson. Possibly, the lawyer said, but we need to prove it. We need to find evidence that directly connects her to the thallium. We need to find out where she got it. We need to establish motive and opportunity. We need to build a case. How do I do that? I asked. I don't know, the lawyer said. But I can tell you that I can't help you do it from the inside. I can help you with the legal side of this. But you need to do the investigation on the outside. You need to find people who are willing to help you gather the evidence that we need. I got out of prison on bail while I waited for my appeal to be heard. My lawyer argued that the new evidence of Brian's poisoning was significant enough to warrant my release while the case was being reviewed. The judge agreed. I was released into the custody of a halfway house while the appeals process worked its way through the system. It was November when I got out. 3 years, almost to the day, since the fire that had killed Brian and destroyed my life. I needed to find people who could help me. I needed to find people who had reasons to want Allison Hanson to be exposed. I needed to find people who were willing to take risks on my behalf. The first person I found was Alexandra Frazier. Alexandra had worked for Hanson Realty. She had been the operations manager, responsible for managing the day-to-day operations of the company. According to the information that I was able to gather, she had discovered evidence of insurance fraud. She had discovered that Allison Hanson had been submitting false claims to insurance companies, inflating the value of properties in order to collect larger insurance payments. When Alexandra had tried to report this fraud to Allison had responded by firing her. Allison had then done something worse. She had altered data in the company's computer systems to make it look like Alexandra had been the one committing fraud. She had made it look like Alexandra had been embezzling money from the company. Alexandra had tried to fight back. She had tried to report the fraud to the authorities. But Allison's lawyers had convinced the authorities that the evidence against Alexandra was stronger than the evidence against Allison. Alexandra had been charged with fraud herself. The case had eventually been dismissed, but only after she had spent months dealing with legal proceedings and legal fees. By that time, her reputation had been destroyed. No one in Salem would hire her. She had become unemployable. I found her in a bar on the outskirts of town. She was drinking alone, nursing a glass of whiskey that had probably been sitting in front of her for hours. She looked like a woman who had given up on life. She looked like a woman who had been destroyed by the same person who had destroyed me. "Alexandra Fraser?" I said, sitting down next to her. She looked at me with suspicion. "My name is Stephanie Boyd," I said. "I was married to Brian Watson." Recognition flickered across her face. "The woman Allison Hanson destroyed," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "But I'm also the woman who has proof that Allison Hanson killed my husband." Alexandra set down her glass. She turned to face me fully. "Tell me everything," she said. I told her about the thallium. I told her about Lawrence Gray. I told her about the tissue samples. I told her about my plan to expose Allison Hanson and prove that she had poisoned Brian. When I finished, Alexandra was quiet for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I need your help," I said. "I need someone who knows how Hanson Realty operates. I need someone who knows Allison Hanson's business practices. I need someone who can help me gather evidence." "Why would I help you?" Alexandra asked. "Why would I risk my life to help you? I'm already destroyed. I'm already ruined. What do I have to gain by helping you?" "Justice," I said. "You have the chance to see Allison Hanson face consequences for what she's done. You have the chance to be part of bringing her down. You have the chance to stop her from destroying anyone else." Alexandra picked up her glass again. She drained it. "Okay," she said. "I'll help you, but not for justice. I don't believe in justice. I'll help you because I want to see Allison Hanson suffer the way she's made me suffer." Over the next several months, Alexandra and I worked together to gather evidence. She still had access to some of Hanson Realty's records, passwords that she had never changed, security clearances that hadn't been revoked. We were able to access company files that showed Allison's financial situation. We were able to see that her company was deeper in debt than anyone realized. We were able to see that she was facing significant financial pressure, that loans were coming due, that her empire was crumbling. We found evidence of insurance fraud. We found evidence that Allison had been submitting false claims to insurance companies for years. We found evidence that she had been using the insurance money to cover the losses in her real estate business. But most importantly, we found a purchase order. A purchase order from a chemical supplier for thallium. The order had been placed 2 weeks before Brian's death. The order had been paid for using a company credit card registered to Allison Hansen's personal account. We had her. We had proof that she had purchased the poison that had killed Brian. We had proof that she had done it deliberately. We had proof that she had framed me for his murder. But we needed more. We needed to prove how she had administered the poison. We needed to prove that she had access to Brian's food or water. We needed to prove that she had the opportunity to poison him. The second person I reached out to was Jose Morris. Jose was a journalist. He had covered my trial for the Salem Tribune. He had written articles suggesting that I was guilty, that I had killed my husband for money, that I was a woman who was capable of incredible coldness and deception. His articles had been picked up by national news outlets. His articles had helped turn me into the villain in this story. I approached Jose at his office at the Tribune. I told him everything that I had discovered. I told him about the thallium. I told him about the tissue samples. I told him about the purchase order for the poison. "Why are you telling me this?" Jose asked. "Because you wrote articles that destroyed me," I said. "Because you helped convict me in the court of public opinion. Because I think you deserve the chance to write the story that actually tells the truth about what happened. And if I write that story, I destroy my relationship with the Hansen family," Jose said. "I destroy my career at the Tribune, because the Tribune is run by people who have business dealings with Hansen Realty. Because the Tribune is not going to want to publish an article that exposes major fraud and murder." "Yes," I said. "That's exactly what will happen. And I'm asking you to do it anyway." Jose looked at me for a long time. "You know," he said, "I wrote those articles because I thought the evidence supported your guilt. I wrote those articles because I believed what I was being told by the police and the prosecutors. But I've always wondered if I had gotten it wrong. I've always wondered if I had helped destroy an innocent woman. And now I have the chance to find out." "So you'll help?" I asked. "I'll help," Jose said. "But I'm warning you, if we do this, I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my reputation in this town. I'm going to be destroyed." "I know," I said. "And I'm asking you to be destroyed anyway, because the truth matters more than your career." Jose helped me reach out to Lawrence Gray. Together we convinced Lawrence to go public with his findings. We convinced him to explain how he had discovered the thallium in Brian's tissue samples. We convinced him to explain how his findings had been suppressed by authorities who were under pressure from Allison Hansen's lawyers. Lawrence was afraid. He understood that he was risking his safety by going public with this information. He understood that he was putting a target on his back. But he also understood that he had a responsibility to tell the truth, and he was willing to accept the consequences of doing so. The four of us, myself, Alexandra, Jose, and Lawrence, began to put together a plan to expose Allison Hansen. We decided that we would leak the information to the media. We decided that we would force the public to confront the truth about what had actually happened the night Brian died. But before we could execute that plan, we had another opportunity fall into our laps. It was almost as if the universe was conspiring to help us expose the truth. Allison Hansen decided to throw a party. The gala was planned to celebrate the legacy of Hansen Realty. It was scheduled for October 31st, Halloween, which was an intentional choice on Allison's part. She wanted to frame the celebration as something beautiful and meaningful, emerging from the ashes of tragedy. She wanted to position herself as a woman who had survived loss and who had come out the other side stronger and more successful. What she didn't know was that the ashes she had emerged from included the poisoned body of her own son. The gala was to be held in the newly renovated Hansen Realty corporate headquarters, a stunning modern building in downtown Salem. It was the kind of building that screamed wealth and power. It was the kind of building that was designed to make people feel small and insignificant when they entered it. I watched the preparations with a cold, detached interest. I watched as Allison hired event planners and caterers and security personnel. I watched as she arranged for press coverage and invited influential people from around the Pacific Northwest. I watched as she prepared to celebrate herself and her success, completely unaware that I was preparing to destroy her. It was Alexandra who came up with the idea of using the gala as the venue for the revelation. She suggested that we could hack into the audio-visual systems at the corporate headquarters. She suggested that we could interrupt Allison's speech with evidence of her crimes. She suggested that we could force her to confront the truth in front of 400 of the most influential people in the region. "It's risky," Lawrence said when Alexandra presented the plan. "If you're caught, you'll be charged with hacking, with fraud, with interfering with a private event. You could go back to prison." "I'm already in prison," I said. "I'm in prison for a crime I didn't commit. I'm in prison in my mind, in my relationships, in the way people look at me when they think I'm a murderer. Being in actual prison for telling the truth is better than being free and knowing that the real murderer is walking around Salem celebrating herself." Jose worked on getting credentials to cover the event as a journalist. He was able to secure a press pass that would get him into the building with camera equipment. He was able to position himself in the control room where the audio-visual systems were managed. Alexandra worked on accessing the computer systems at Hansen Realty. She was able to create backdoor access to the network, which would allow us to take control of the presentation systems during the gala. Lawrence worked on preparing the evidence that we would present during the gala. He compiled all of his findings. He prepared his slides. He prepared his statement. He prepared himself for the moment when he would have to stand in front of 400 people and tell them the truth about what he had discovered in Brian's tissue samples. And I prepared myself mentally for what was about to happen. I prepared myself for the moment when Allison Hansen would realize that her secret was no longer a secret. I prepared myself for the moment when she would understand that I knew the truth. I prepared myself for the moment when she would see that I had survived and that I was coming for her. The night of the gala arrived. I was not invited, obviously. Allison had no intention of allowing me anywhere near her celebration, but Jose was there as a journalist. Alexandra was there as an employee of a catering company, working in the kitchen. Lawrence was standing by in a hotel room nearby, ready to video conference into the event if needed. I was waiting in a car outside the building, listening to them over a secure communication system. Allison gave her speech at 8:30 in the evening. She stood on the stage in front of 400 people. She was wearing a red dress that probably cost thousands of dollars. She was glowing with the kind of confidence that comes from believing that you are untouchable, that you are beyond judgment, that you are a person who can do whatever you want without consequences. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she said into the microphone. Her voice was smooth and practiced and designed to manipulate. "Tonight, we celebrate the legacy of Hanson Realty. We celebrate the buildings we have built. We celebrate the communities we have transformed. We celebrate the vision that has driven me to achieve what I have achieved." I could hear the pride in her voice. I could hear the self-congratulation. I could hear the absolute conviction that she had done nothing wrong, that she had not poisoned her own son, that she had not framed an innocent woman, that she was a person of integrity and honor. Jose was in position in the control room. He was ready to initiate the takeover of the audio-visual systems. He was waiting for the signal from Alexandra. "Tonight is also a time to remember," Allison continued. "A time to remember those who are no longer with us. My son, Brian, died 3 years ago in a tragic accident. But tonight, instead of mourning, I choose to celebrate the legacy that he left behind. I choose to celebrate the man he was and the impact he had on this world." Alexandra sent the signal. Jose initiated the takeover of the audio-visual systems. For a moment, nothing happened. For a moment, I thought that the plan had failed, that we had miscalculated, that Allison Hanson would get to finish her speech and continue her celebration and continue her life as if she had done nothing wrong. But then the screen behind Allison came to life. And instead of showing images of Hanson Realty's greatest achievements, the screen showed evidence. Evidence of the thallium purchase, evidence of the insurance fraud, evidence of the financial desperation that had driven Allison to poison her own son. The room erupted into confusion. People were standing up, trying to understand what they were seeing. Journalists were rushing toward the stage, trying to get closer to the evidence. On the screen, a video began to play. It was security footage from Hanson Realty offices. It showed Allison Hanson walking into Brian's office 3 hours before the fire. It showed her carrying a small vial. It showed her adding something to a bottle on his desk. It showed her leaving, looking over her shoulder to make sure that no one had seen her. I watched as Allison's face changed. I watched as she understood that her secret was no longer a secret. I watched as she understood that she had been exposed. The video cut to audio. It was a recording of a conversation between Allison and one of her employees. The conversation was from 6 months before Brian's death. In the conversation, Allison was discussing her financial situation. She was discussing the fact that she was $10 million in debt. She was discussing the fact that her company was on the verge of collapse. She was discussing the fact that she needed money immediately or she would lose everything. And then she said the words that proved her guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. "If Brian dies, I collect $500,000 from his life insurance. That money buys me time. That money gives me a chance to stabilize the company. That money is the difference between success and failure." The room went absolutely silent. People who had been standing up sat down. Journalists who had been taking notes stopped writing. Everyone was processing what they had just heard. And then I walked into the building. I didn't have credentials. I didn't have permission. I just walked in through the main entrance and I walked toward the stage. The security personnel tried to stop me, but the chaos of the revelation had created enough confusion that I was able to reach the stage before anyone could stop me. I took the microphone from Allison's hands. 3 years ago, I said, my voice steady and clear, this woman poisoned her own son. She poisoned him, and then she burned down my house, and then she let me be blamed for his death. She let me be tried for murder. She let me be convicted for a crime I didn't commit. She let me spend 3 years in prison for her crime. I looked directly at Allison. You told the world that I was a murderer, I said. You told the police that I had killed Brian for money. You told the jury that I was a woman who was capable of incredible evil. And you did all of this while you were the one who had poisoned your own son. You were the one who had killed him. You were the one who was evil. Allison's face had gone completely white. She looked like a woman who was drowning, who was trying to understand how her perfect world had collapsed so completely and so quickly. I didn't kill him, she said, her voice breaking. I never meant to kill him. I only meant to make him sick. I only meant to give him a reason to come to me for help. I only meant to... You only meant to poison your son and let an innocent woman be imprisoned for his death. I finished for her. You only meant to protect your reputation at any cost. You only meant to make sure that your world continued to exist, no matter who you had to destroy to make that happen. The police arrived within minutes. They placed Allison under arrest. They read her rights. They took her away in handcuffs while cameras flashed and journalists shouted questions. I stood on the stage and I watched her disappear. And I realized that I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sad. I felt sad for Brian, who had died because his mother cared more about her reputation than she cared about his life. I felt sad for me, who had lost 3 years of my life in prison for a crime I didn't commit. I felt sad for all of the people whose lives had been destroyed by a woman's desperate attempt to protect herself. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated and painful in ways that I had not anticipated, because even with the evidence that we had presented at the gala, even with the recordings and the security footage and the testimony of Lawrence Gray, there were legal questions about how we had obtained that evidence. Jose had hacked into the audio-visual systems at Hanson Realty. Alexandra had accessed company computer systems without authorization. Lawrence had retained tissue samples that he was not legally supposed to retain. I had been in prison when we executed our plan, which created questions about whether I had violated the terms of my bail. All of these questions had to be addressed in court before we could even get to the question of whether Allison Hanson was guilty of poisoning her son and framing me for his murder. Allison's defense team argued that the evidence we had presented was inadmissible because it had been obtained illegally. They argued that Jose's hacking was a violation of federal law. They argued that Alexandra's access to company systems was a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. They argued that Lawrence's retention of tissue samples violated chain of custody protocols. The prosecutor argued that while the methods we had used to obtain the evidence were questionable, the evidence itself was probative, and that the truth of what had happened should not be obscured by technical questions about how that truth had been discovered. The judge, a woman named Patricia Morgan, who had a reputation for being tough but fair, took several weeks to make her decision. When she finally issued her ruling, it was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but that allowed the case to move forward. The judge ruled that the evidence that Jose had obtained through hacking was inadmissible. The judge ruled that the evidence that Alexandra had obtained through unauthorized access to company systems was inadmissible. But the judge ruled that Lawrence's testimony about the toxicology findings was admissible because Lawrence had obtained the tissue samples through legitimate channels before the protocols had changed, and his analysis was scientifically sound, even if the retention of the samples was technically improper. Importantly, the judge also ruled that because Allison's confession had been made publicly at the gala, in front of 400 witnesses, that confession was admissible as evidence in the criminal proceeding. Allison's defense team tried to argue that she had been coerced into making the confession, that she had been emotionally distressed and therefore not in a state of mind to understand the consequences of what she was saying. But the judge rejected those arguments. The judge noted that a public confession, witnessed by hundreds of people and captured on numerous camera phones and journalist equipment, was perhaps the most reliable form of evidence that could be presented in court. The trial itself lasted for 3 months. The prosecutor built a case showing Allison's financial desperation. The prosecutor presented evidence of the insurance fraud. The prosecutor presented Allison's purchase of thallium. The prosecutor presented Lawrence's analysis of the thallium in Brian's tissue samples. The prosecutor presented Allison's recorded admission that she had purchased poison and administered it to her son. Allison's defense team tried to argue that even if Allison had administered thallium to Brian, there was no evidence that she had intended for him to die. They argued that perhaps she had intended only to make him sick. They argued that perhaps she had not understood how poisonous thallium was. They argued that the death might have been accidental, but the prosecutor pointed out that Allison had then set the fire. Allison had then allowed me to be blamed for the fire. Allison had then allowed me to be tried and convicted for murder. If Allison had truly believed that she had only meant to make her son sick, she would have called for an ambulance. She would have confessed to poisoning him. She would not have burned down a house and allowed an innocent woman to be imprisoned for the death that had resulted from her actions. After 3 months of testimony and argument, the jury deliberated for 2 days. They returned with a verdict of guilty on all counts: second-degree murder, insurance fraud, and filing a false report to law enforcement. The judge sentenced Allison Hansen to 40 years in prison. The judge noted that the severity of the sentence was justified by the fact that Allison had not only killed her son, but had then allowed an innocent woman to be imprisoned for that murder. The judge noted that Allison's actions had caused immense harm to multiple people over an extended period of time. The judge noted that justice required that Allison Hansen spend significant time in prison, paying for those actions. When the verdict was announced, I was sitting in the courtroom. I didn't feel what I had expected to feel. I had spent 3 years in prison. I had spent months preparing this case. I had spent enormous amounts of energy and emotion and courage gathering the evidence and presenting it to the world. I had expected that when Allison was finally convicted, when justice was finally served, I would feel relief or satisfaction or vindication. But what I felt was emptiness. What I felt was the knowledge that nothing that was happening in this courtroom could bring Brian back. Nothing that was happening in this courtroom could restore the 3 years of my life that I had lost in prison. Nothing that was happening in this courtroom could repair the relationships that had been damaged, the trust that had been broken, the way that I would forever be seen by people in Salem as the woman who killed her husband, regardless of whether the court now said I was innocent. After the trial, I was formally exonerated. The conviction was overturned. I was released from my bail conditions and my probation. I was a free woman, legally speaking. But I was not free. Not really. Not yet. 1 year after Allison Hansen was convicted, I took the money that I had received as compensation for my wrongful conviction, and I did something that I had not planned to do, but that felt absolutely necessary. I bought the house on Maple Street where Brian had died. The house had been rebuilt after the fire, but it had sat empty for years, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had occurred there. I bought it and I transformed it into something new. I established the Salem Wives Defense Center. The center was designed to provide legal representation to women who had been wrongfully convicted, particularly women who had been framed for crimes that they did not commit. The center would provide free or low-cost legal representation. The center would investigate potential wrongful convictions. The center would work to bring justice to women who had been victimized by a system that was often stacked against them. I hired a team of lawyers and investigators. I reached out to Jose Morris, who had quit his job at the Tribune after the gala and who had been looking for something meaningful to do with his career. I hired Alexandra, who had been struggling to find employment after her experience with Allison Hansen. I created a position for Lawrence Gray as a scientific consultant because his expertise in toxicology and forensic science would be invaluable in investigating potential wrongful convictions. The Salem Wives Defense Center took on cases. We investigated claims of wrongful conviction. We discovered evidence of police misconduct. We discovered evidence of prosecutorial misconduct. We discovered evidence of laboratory errors and misidentification, and all of the various ways that the justice system can fail, particularly when the person who has been accused is a woman. Our first case was a woman named Margaret Chen, who had been convicted of poisoning her husband 15 years earlier. Margaret had spent 15 years in prison for a crime that she did not commit. She had been convicted based on testimony from a jailhouse informant, testimony that was later revealed to be unreliable. We took her case. We conducted our own investigation. We gathered new evidence, and we were able to get her conviction overturned and her case retried. This time, she was acquitted. Our second case was a woman named Diana Woodhouse, who had been convicted of killing her abusive partner during an incident of domestic violence. Diana had spent 12 years in prison, claiming that she had acted in self-defense. We investigated her case. We hired experts in domestic violence to testify about the dynamics of abusive relationships. We presented evidence that Diana's partner had a history of violence against women, and we were able to get her conviction overturned. Through the work of the Salem Wives Defense Center, we were able to help dozens of women. We were able to investigate hundreds of cases. We were able to bring attention to systemic problems in the way that justice is administered to women. And through this work, I found healing. Not complete healing, not forgiveness, but healing nonetheless. 2 years after I established the Salem Wives Defense Center, I received a letter from Allison Hanson. She was writing from prison. She wanted me to know something. The letter read, "Stephanie, I know that you probably don't want to hear from me. I know that I have no right to ask anything of you. But I want you to know that I have been thinking about what I did. I have been thinking about Brian. I have been thinking about you. I am writing simply to tell you that I understand. Allison Hanson." I read that letter and I cried. I cried for the 3 years I had spent in prison. I cried for the life I had lost. I cried for Brian, who had died because his mother cared more about her reputation than she cared about him. I cried for Allison, who was spending the rest of her life in prison paying for her crimes. I cried for all of the people whose lives had been destroyed by the events that had unfolded 3 years earlier. But I also understood something in reading that letter. I understood that Allison's understanding of what she had done was not enough to undo what she had done. Understanding and regret do not restore lives. Understanding and regret do not repair the damage that has been done. Understanding and regret are simply the acknowledgement that a mistake has been made, and that acknowledgement, while important, cannot change the past. I did not write back to Allison. I did not send her forgiveness. But I did something that I think is more important. I did not hate her. I did not spend my time thinking about her. I did not spend my energy being angry at her. I moved forward. I lived my life. I worked to help other women who had been victimized by a justice system that had failed them. On the 3rd anniversary of the fire that killed Brian, I went to the cemetery where he was buried. I brought flowers. I sat by his grave and I talked to him. "I'm still here," I said to his grave. "I'm still alive. I'm still fighting. And I'm using what happened to help other people. I'm using my pain to reduce other people's pain. I'm using my experience to prevent other people from experiencing what I experienced." I didn't feel Brian's presence. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits or the idea that dead people can communicate with the living. But I did feel something. I felt a sense of purpose. I felt a sense of understanding that my suffering could be transformed into something meaningful, that my pain could be used to help others, that the tragedy that had befallen me could be the catalyst for change. On the 5th anniversary of the fire, I received a call from the district attorney. She told me that she wanted to establish a special task force to investigate potential wrongful convictions in Salem County. She wanted to hire me to head that task force. She wanted to use my expertise and my experience to help identify and investigate cases where justice might not have been served. I accepted the position. Over the next few years, I worked with law enforcement and the justice system to investigate cases of potential wrongful conviction. I worked with the DNA evidence that was available. I worked with the forensic evidence that existed. I worked with the testimony of people who had been part of the original investigations. And I helped overturn 15 wrongful convictions. I helped free 15 people who should never have been imprisoned in the first place. I helped restore their lives and their reputations and their ability to move forward. It is not enough. No amount of work that I do will be enough to compensate for the years I lost in prison. No amount of work that I do will be enough to bring Brian back. No amount of work that I do will be enough to undo the damage that has been done. But it is something. It is meaningful. It is the best that I can do with the life that I have been given. Looking back on everything that has happened, I can see that I was destroyed by accusations of murder. But I was also saved by the truth about that murder. I was destroyed by the justice system that failed me. But I was also given the opportunity to work to transform that system. I am no longer invisible. People know who I am. People know my story. People come to me when they believe that they have been wrongfully convicted because they have heard that I have fought for women who have been falsely accused, that I have dedicated my life to helping people who have experienced what I experienced. But I carry the weight of what happened. I carry the knowledge that Brian died because his mother cared more about her reputation than she cared about him. I carry the knowledge that I spent 3 years in prison for a crime I did not commit. I carry the knowledge that the only thing that saved me was the persistence of a chemical engineer who refused to let the truth be buried, and the courage of people who were willing to help me expose that truth at significant cost to themselves. And I carry the knowledge that justice is not clean. Justice is not simple. Justice does not restore what has been broken. Justice is simply the acknowledgement that a wrong has been committed, and that the person who committed that wrong must face consequences. Justice cannot undo the past. Justice can only attempt to shape the future in a way that might prevent similar wrongs from occurring. On Halloween night, the night when the boundary between the living and the dead is supposedly at its thinnest, I think of Brian. I think of the man he was and the life he should have lived. I think of the fact that he was destroyed by the people who were supposed to love him. I think of the fact that his death, while tragic, became the impetus for me to help other people. I do not know if that is consolation. I do not know if that is redemption. I know only that I am still here, and I am using my presence to make a difference. I am no longer the invisible woman who was blamed for a crime she did not commit. I am the woman who has fought for her innocence and who has survived to tell about it. I am the woman who has dedicated her life to helping others who have experienced what I experienced. I am the woman who knows what it means to be destroyed and to rise again from the ashes. I am the widow who survived, and I am not going to be silent. That night, after whispering those final words into the dark, I walked home beneath a sky that looked like it had been powdered with ash. The street lamps hummed, steady and indifferent, while the wind carried the crisp scent of leaves that had already surrendered to autumn. I unlocked the front door of the Maple Street house, now our center, and paused in the threshold. The foyer light spilled across the polished floorboards, turning the grain of the wood into a river of amber. Inside, the quiet was not empty. It was full. The intake desk still held a half-drunk mug of mint tea. A stack of case files sat open like thin chests filled with breath. The lamps we'd chosen together, Alexandra, with her soft eye for light, glowed at a low setting, as if the house knew people rested here, healed here, and tried to begin again. I stood in the center of the hall and let the stillness wrap around me the way a shawl does on the first cold night of the year. I was tired, but it was a clean kind of tired, the kind that comes after work that matters. On my desk upstairs lay the letter from Allison, folded and refolded until the creases had become a second script. I didn't touch it. I'd learned that not all paper needed handling to be understood. Some words sit inside you, whether your fingers meet them or not. I opened the window above the desk. Maple Street breathed in. Distant laughter, a car door closing, the hush of someone's footsteps on the sidewalk. I thought of Brian, not the facts of him, not the court records, not the version of his name people brought up like a delicate piece of china. I thought of the laugh lines he never grew into. I thought of the stubbornness that used to make me furious and now made me smile. I thought of the way his kindness had been a kind of rebellion in a world that rewarded the sharpest elbows. "Here," I said into the spare room. "I'm here." The moon lifted, silver and spare, and the wind pushed a small drift of leaves along the curb. I imagined the house as a lung and all of us, for a moment, breathing together. In the morning, the center woke early. Jose arrived with his always too strong coffee and a new policy memo he wanted me to read. Alexandra came in, humming some old song she'd found the night before, something with a sweet melancholy that lingered in the hallways long after she'd stopped. Lawrence texted to say a courier had just picked up a box bound for his lab. Fibers, soil, a swab he suspected might tell a different story than the one written into an arrest report. We met in the kitchen like a small, mismatched family. Steam rose from every mug, our voices braided and unbraided, case updates, small jokes, plans. Outside, the maples had exchanged their summer certainty for a braver palate, rust, claret, honey. Even the air felt like a lesson in letting go of what you cannot keep. At 10, a woman named Tamsin walked through our door. She carried a folder with corners pressed into perfect right angles, the way you hold something that must not spill. Her eyes kept searching, as if truth might be hiding in the crown moldings. I asked if she wanted tea, the way I always do, and she nodded without certainty, as if permission to be comforted required some further legal form. While the kettle sang, she told us her story, not all at once, not dramatically. Layer by layer, the way sediment gathers and makes a shape only when you step back far enough to see it. As I listened, I felt again the ache that never leaves, the ache of recognizing the pattern, the blame that sticks to women like a burr, the way doubt is distributed unequally, and mercy too. When she finished, the room was so quiet I could hear the clock in the intake office downstairs. I said the same thing I say each time, a sentence I once had to learn how to mean. We believe you. We will look. Believing is not the end of the work, it is the beginning. It is not naivete. It is the discipline of refusing to accept the easiest narrative when a harder, truer one waits in the dark. That afternoon, while Alexandra drafted records requests and Jose assembled a timeline, I walked the perimeter of the house the way I sometimes do when a case is new. The sun had warmed the porch rail, the paint, a quiet blue we chose because it felt like a promise, gleamed. Neighbors passed with the sort of nod reserved for places that have gone from being whispered about to being entrusted. I waved back. It is no small thing to be allowed to stay. When I came back inside, the hallway smelled faintly of sage. We keep a bowl there with slips of paper, names of women freed, dates of dismissals, a single word reminder from each case. Courage, we had written once. Patience, another time. Today's slip, just added, said simply, begin. Evening brought rain, the patient kind that does not dramatize the sky. I sat by the window with the case file of a woman named Rowena who had signed a confession after 17 hours in an interview room that had been kept at a temperature designed to loosen resolve. Lawrence's notes lined the margin in his tidy hand. There are so many ways to say the same thing. This is not how truth behaves. At some hour, that felt like it belonged to no one. I heard the faintest knock. When I opened the door, the porch light drew a small square of gold around a man I didn't know. He introduced himself quietly as Brian's former teacher. He'd brought, he said, a photo from a field trip he'd found while clearing a drawer, the kind of image that survives because it slips between pages and waits there, patient as moss. I invited him in out of the rain. We stood under the entry lamp while the house listened. In the photo, Brian was mid-laugh, not posed, not framing himself for anyone's eye, just caught in the rare moment when joy forgets to perform and simply is. Behind him, a museum exhibit about constellations blurred into a gentle constellation of lights. "I thought you might want this," the teacher said. I did. I wanted it enough that my fingers trembled. But I also knew that wanting the past to be kind is a wish with no court to petition. I thanked him. We spoke a few minutes about nothing that hurt, how the school had changed, how that museum swapped out the exhibit the next year. When he left, the house felt briefly larger, as if a window I hadn't noticed had been cracked for air. I placed the photo on the bookshelf opposite the door to the old living room, the one we now use for community meetings. Not a shrine, just a witness. Then I returned to Rowena's file and read by lamplight until the words softened, the way cloth does under a steady touch. Days became a low, steady drum. Case intake, evidence review, letters answered with care, even when the answer was, "We cannot take this now." The center breathed, and I breathed with it. There is a rhythm to service work that will save you if you let it. Morning hope, afternoon effort, evening humility. Repeat. The epilogue to any story tells you what happened next. But living the epilogue means understanding that next is not one thing. It is a braid of ordinary afternoons and sharp, bright midnights and phone calls that begin with, "I don't know who else to try." It is learning which silences mean peace and which require you to lean forward and say, gently, "Tell me more." A week after Halloween, the leaves thinned to a delicate lace, and the sky turned its careful winter gray. A reporter emailed asking if I would comment on the task force's 15th exoneration. She wanted a quote that sounded like triumph. I wrote back with the truth. Every exoneration is a door opened, not a parade. Behind each door waits a life that needs repairing. The work begins again. That afternoon, a package arrived addressed in a neat, unfamiliar hand. Inside was a simple scarf, the color of tea. No note, only a tag that read, "Warmth Travels." I smiled despite myself. Some kindnesses insist on anonymity, not to be coy, but to keep the focus where it belongs. On the quiet fact that someone thought of you while the world kept moving. Night settled early. I closed the files and turned off all but the lamp in the entry. I locked the front door, then stood there a moment, hand still resting on the bolt. listening to the house settle. Houses have a vocabulary: the gentle knock of pipes, the thin sigh along a window frame, the modest crack of timber acknowledging what it holds. This one speaks in a language I'm still learning. Some nights I think it says, "You may rest." Others, it says, "Not yet." Before bed, I took the photo of Brian from the shelf and set it on my desk. The moon hung low, round as a coin. For a moment, the room became a small theater of light. Paper turned silver. The edges of the frame went soft. I touched the glass and did not apologize for the tenderness in my chest. "I'm still here," I said again. This time not to a grave, not to the night, but to the part of myself that once thought survival meant silence. "I'm still here, and I am not done." I did not expect an answer. I did not need one. The answer was the day waiting just beyond sleep, the kettle warming, the door opening, the first voice at 10 a.m. saying, "Are you the ones who?" And us replying, "Yes." "Please, sit. Tell us everything. We will listen. We will begin." In that promise, there is a kind of peace, not the kind that erases sorrow, the kind that chooses, again and again, to give sorrow a job, to put it to work as a lantern, held high enough that someone else can see their way to the door. So I turned off the light, and the house exhaled, and the rain turned thin as thread. The photo on the desk held its small constellation, and I slept, not like a woman who had outrun the past, but like a woman who had finally given the past a place to sit down, a chair at a table where the work continues tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, for as long as there are stories that need a better ending.